The courthouse was alive with noise and movement from the very beginning of the morning. Sunlight fell in through tall windows, casting long shadows across wooden benches where reporters, lawyers, and curious citizens filled every seat. The trial was the most talked about case in months, and everyone wanted to witness history unfold. At the center of it all sat Evelyn Cross, a CEO whose company had built an empire, but also carried dark whispers of corruption. People whispered her name with equal parts respect and suspicion. Yet, sitting near the back of the courtroom, Marcus Hale felt none of the weight of high finance or corporate scandals. His mind was somewhere else, on his daughter Clara, who was at school, waiting for her father to come home later that day. He was not supposed to be in this courtroom at all. He had picked up extra work as a part-time security volunteer, because every additional dollar mattered for raising a child alone. Marcus had once served in the military. Those years had taught him discipline, patience, and how to stand strong in moments of chaos. But now his battles were far simpler and heavier at the same time. Paying bills on time, making sure Clara had her favorite breakfast before school, and trying to build a safe home where she could grow without fear. His late wife had been the anchor of their small family, and after her passing, Marcus vowed never to let their daughter feel abandoned. As he stood by the courtroom doors that morning, Marcus kept reminding himself that this was just another shift. He only needed to stand watch, guide people to their places, and keep order if things grew loud. Nothing more. But destiny often comes uninvited, and no one in that room could have predicted what was about to unfold. The trial began with the usual rhythm. Lawyers argued with carefully chosen words. The judge listened intently, tapping his pen from time to time. Evelyn sat with a composed face, her hands folded in her lap, though anyone who looked closely could see the tension behind her calm mask. Reporters typed furiously on their laptops, capturing every statement. It was business as usual until the heavy wooden doors slammed open. At first, people thought it was a late arrival, but then the sound of shouting filled the air, and a group of intruders pushed their way in. Their presence froze the room instantly. They carried an aura of threat, and though Marcus noticed their hands reaching into their jackets, his instincts reacted before his mind even formed a plan. He moved without hesitation, not toward the exit, but toward Evelyn. In that instant, something deep inside him made a choice. No matter what happened, no innocent life would be lost on his watch. The room erupted in confusion. People screamed, some ducking under benches, others rushing toward the doors.
Back to the judge.
Shouted for order, his voice lost in the chaos. Marcus reached Evelyn's side and pulled her toward the corner. Placing himself between her and the approaching danger, he felt a sharp pain as he stumbled back. But his grip on her tightened. His shirt darkened across the chest, but his focus never wavered. He braced himself in front of Evelyn, his arms outstretched as if his very body could form a wall. The room fell into stunned silence. Everyone watched as Marcus stood firm, swaying. Slightly, but unbroken. His voice, steady and commanding, cut through the noise. "Stay behind me," he told Evelyn. "You are not alone." For Marcus, this moment was not about Evelyn's wealth or reputation. It was about his promise as a father, as a man who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. He thought of Clara's smile, the way she hugged him before leaving for school, the way she looked at him as if he were the strongest man in the world. That belief gave him the strength to stay upright when his body wanted to collapse. Officers quickly surged forward, surrounding the intruders. The tension in the room cracked as law enforcement gained control, but all eyes remained on Marcus. Reporters who had come for a corporate scandal now witnessed a story of raw humanity. A man with nothing to gain had risked everything for someone who had spent years building walls around herself. Evelyn, who had always measured people by their business worth, was speechless. She had been shielded not by money or influence, but by the courage of a stranger whose only concern was to protect. Marcus swayed, exhaustion washing over him. A medic rushed to his side, urging him to sit, but he shook his head. He would not leave until he was sure Evelyn was safe, until the chaos had settled. His voice was quiet but clear when he spoke again. "Get her out first," he said, nodding toward Evelyn. "Make sure she is safe." The officers obeyed, guiding her toward the hallway. Evelyn glanced back, her eyes meeting Marcus's for the first time. In that silent exchange, something passed between them, a recognition of sacrifice that words could not capture. The courtroom that morning had been meant for judgment on paper, for weighing evidence and deciding guilt. But in that moment, a deeper truth revealed itself. Sometimes the greatest acts of justice are not written in law books, but lived in the choices of ordinary people. As Marcus was finally led away, his thoughts drifted once more to Clara. He hoped she would never hear about the danger her father faced today, but if she did, he wanted her to know why he had acted as he did. It was not heroism for glory. It was a father's instinct, a promise kept not only to his daughter, but to the memory of his wife. By the time the courtroom emptied and the chaos subsided, one truth remained clear. Marcus Hale had changed the course of the trial forever, not through argument or evidence, but through sacrifice. The trial of Evelyn Cross was no longer just about corruption. It had become a story of courage, love, and the strength of an ordinary man who chose to stand firm in the face of chaos. And as the world outside began to hear whispers of what had taken place inside, a new story started to spread, one that would echo far beyond the walls of that courthouse. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic. The steady rhythm of machines filling the silence with a reminder that life was fragile and yet fighting to hold on. Marcus Hale lay on the narrow bed, his chest rising and falling slowly under the bandages. His face was pale, but even in that state, there was a quiet strength about him. The same strength that had carried him through the moment when the world seemed to fall apart in the courtroom. Nurses moved quietly around him, checking vitals and adjusting tubes, but their eyes lingered on him with respect. They had all heard what happened. Everyone had. The story had already begun to spread beyond the courthouse walls, carried by reporters who had rushed to capture the event. Words like hero, protector, and sacrifice filled the headlines. But Marcus remained still, unaware of the storm of attention building outside. His thoughts, drifting between flashes of memory and heavy sleep, were not on fame or recognition. They were on his daughter, Clara. Clara had been rushed to the hospital by a neighbor after the school called with news. She sat by his bedside now, her small hands gripping his much larger one, as if holding on tight enough could anchor him here forever. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was determination in her young face. She whispered to him over and over, telling him he had promised never to leave her, reminding him that he still had to be there for her school recital next month, reminding him that she still needed help with her math homework, reminding him that she could not do all this alone. Every word seemed to reach him in his unconscious state, pulling him closer to the surface. For Marcus, everything in life came back to Clara. Every late-night job, every extra shift, every decision to push through exhaustion, it was all for her. He had promised his late wife that their daughter would never feel abandoned, never feel like the world had taken too much from her. That promise had carried him through grief, through hardship, through days when the weight of responsibility seemed too heavy. And it was that same promise that had guided his instinct in the courtroom. He had not thought of Evelyn Cross as a CEO or as a woman on trial. In that moment, he had only seen another human being in danger, another person who deserved a chance to go home alive to the people who cared for her. He had acted because it was the right thing to do. As night fell outside the hospital, Evelyn herself appeared in the doorway of the room. Dressed simply, her usual air of control and confidence had been replaced by something far quieter, almost hesitant. For years she had been known as untouchable, her life guarded by walls of wealth, lawyers, and influence. But now she stood in the hallway of a hospital, unsure of what to say to the man who had changed everything with one selfless act. She watched Clara holding his hand, saw the love in that simple gesture, and felt something stir within her. Evelyn had built her career on ambition, often stepping over others to reach higher. But here was a man who had risked everything for someone he barely knew. She finally stepped inside. Her heels clicking softly on the floor, Clara looked up. her eyes narrowing with the instinctive protectiveness of a child who feared losing the one person she loved most. Evelyn knelt beside her, her voice soft and genuine. She told Clara that her father had saved her life, that his courage had changed more than just a trial, and that she would do everything in her power to make sure he recovered. Clara listened, not fully understanding the weight of those words, but feeling the sincerity in Evelyn's tone. Marcus stirred then, his eyes fluttering open for the first time since arriving. His vision was blurry, the room spinning slightly, but he recognized his daughter immediately. Her face lit up with relief, and she squeezed his hand tighter, whispering that she knew he would wake up. Evelyn remained quiet, watching the exchange between father and daughter with an ache in her chest she had not expected. When Marcus finally noticed her standing there, he frowned slightly, confusion mixing with fatigue. "You should not be here," he murmured, his voice hoarse but steady. "It is not safe." Evelyn shook her head, her voice breaking slightly. "I am here because you gave me safety when you had none to spare. I needed to see you. I needed to say thank you." Marcus said nothing at first. Gratitude was not what he had been seeking. He had not acted for thanks or recognition. But as he looked at her, he saw the weight in her expression, the way her eyes seemed to carry guilt and realization. Perhaps she had spent her life surrounded by people who cared for her position more than her person. Perhaps this moment had shown her what true humanity looked like. Clara interrupted then, her small voice cutting through the heavy air. "My dad always keeps his promises. He told me he would protect people. That is what he does." The words were simple, but they carried a truth that silenced the room. Marcus closed his eyes again, his strength fading, but inside he felt the warmth of pride. His daughter understood. She saw him for what he truly was, and that was enough. Outside the hospital, reporters waited. Cameras clicked whenever a doctor passed through the doors, hungry for updates. The world wanted to hear about the single father who had stepped into danger without hesitation, about the act that had changed the course of one of the most high-profile trials in the country. Yet inside that room, the noise of the world faded away. There was only a father fighting to keep a promise, a daughter who believed in him, a woman who had begun to question everything she had built her life upon. As dawn approached, Marcus drifted into a more restful sleep. Evelyn promised Clara she would return the next day, that she would not forget what had been given to her. Clara nodded, still holding her father's hand, unwilling to let go. The hospital remained quiet, but an unspoken truth hung in the air. Sacrifice carries weight, but it also carries power. The power to change people, to awaken something long buried, to remind the world that courage does not come from wealth or status, but from love and conviction. And as the first light of morning touched the city, the story of Marcus Hale spread further, reaching strangers who saw in him a reflection of what humanity could be. Not perfect, not invincible, but willing to stand up when it mattered most. Asterisk, the soft glow of morning sunlight filled the hospital room, spreading across the pale walls and drawing long shadows on the floor. Marcus Hale opened his eyes slowly, adjusting to the brightness, his body still heavy with exhaustion. For a moment, he forgot where he was. But then the familiar weight of pain in his chest reminded him of the choice he had made the day before. His hand shifted slightly, and he felt the small, warm grip of Claire's fingers still locked around his. She had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting against the mattress, her breathing steady. Even in sleep, she had refused to let him go. Marcus gazed at her, his heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. She was far too young to carry the weight of fear that came with seeing her father injured. Yet she had sat there bravely, holding his hand as if her belief alone could keep him alive. He thought of all the nights he had tucked her into bed, promising her that no matter what, he would always come back to her. He had meant those words every time. The memory of his wife's voice still lingered in his heart, reminding him to keep that vow no matter how hard the road became. The sound of the door opening drew his attention. A nurse stepped in, followed by Evelyn Cross. She looked different from the polished figure the world had grown used to. Her makeup was minimal, her expression softened, and there was no trace of the commanding CEO persona she was known for. Instead, she carried a bouquet of fresh flowers and a quiet humility that seemed almost foreign to her. She paused at the doorway, as if uncertain whether she belonged in the room, then slowly walked to the table beside his bed and placed the flowers there. "You should not have done what you did," Marcus said quietly, his voice still raspy from weakness. His eyes held hers, calm but firm. "You should not have been in danger in the first place." Evelyn sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "Maybe not," she admitted, her voice low. "But I was. And you. You gave me more than protection. You gave me perspective." Marcus frowned slightly, trying to read her expression. For years, she had been known for her power, her ability to control rooms with her words and presence. But here she sat, vulnerable, her gaze unsteady as if she were wrestling with thoughts she had never allowed herself to face before. "I have built a life around numbers, contracts, and boardrooms," Evelyn continued. "I thought strength came from power and influence. But yesterday, I saw something different. You had no reason to stand in front of me. You had nothing to gain, and still, you did it. That changed me." Marcus looked at her for a long moment before shifting his gaze back to Clara, who still slept peacefully. His voice softened. "I made a promise a long time ago, to my wife, to my daughter, that I would always do what is right, that I would always protect those who cannot protect themselves. It does not matter if I know them or not. Promise is a promise." Those words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Evelyn felt a sting behind her eyes, a quiet guilt that years of success had never been able to awaken. Her empire, her wealth, her titles, all of it, meant little compared to the simple truth of a father keeping his word to his child. Clara stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw her father awake, she sat up quickly, her small arms wrapping around him with surprising strength. "You are awake," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I knew you would be okay, you promised." Marcus kissed the top of her head, his hand gently smoothing her hair. "I promised," he said softly, "and I will always keep that promise." Evelyn watched the exchange, her heart tightening at the sight. She had spent her life building walls, avoiding attachments, convinced that emotions were weaknesses that could be exploited, but here in this hospital room, she saw the purest strength she had ever witnessed, the bond between a father and his daughter. Unshakable, even in the face of pain. Outside the room, the world buzzed with news. Reporters speculated about what had happened in the courtroom, about what Marcus's actions meant for Evelyn's case, about what it revealed of her character. But none of that mattered here. Inside these walls, there was only family, promise. It's a kind of courage that could not be bought or measured. Later that afternoon, excused herself, promising to return. Marcus watched her go, still unsure of what to make of her presence. He was not a man who trusted easily, especially not people from her world. Yet something about the way she had looked at Clara made him believe that perhaps change was possible. Even in people who had spent years chasing power, as the room grew quiet again, Marcus thought of the future. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more bills, more long nights, more sacrifices to make. But he also knew he was not afraid of the struggle. Every hardship was worth it, because at the end of the day he had Clara's trust, and her belief in him was stronger than any pain he carried. When night came again, Clara fell asleep beside him once more, her hand never leaving his. Marcus stared at the ceiling, the faint hum of machines in his ears, and whispered into the stillness, "I will never break my promise." And though no one else heard it, the weight of those words filled the room like a vow written into the fabric of his life. Asterisk. The evening city lights glowed like scattered stars as Evelyn Cross sat in the back of her car, staring out at the passing streets. The world outside carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside her, everything felt altered. The image of Marcus standing in front of her in the courtroom, his body shielding hers without hesitation, replayed in her mind over and over again. She had been in countless boardrooms where people swore loyalty to her, countless meetings where words of respect were spoken to win her favor. But but never once had anyone placed their very life between her and danger. That act had forced her to confront a truth she had long buried. She had built her empire on influence and power, but she had never truly understood what it meant to sacrifice. The car stopped outside her penthouse, a tower of glass and steel that overlooked the city's skyline. She stepped out, heels clicking against the pavement, and walked into the silent lobby. The staff greeted her with polite nods, their faces carefully professional, but she barely noticed. She moved through the grand space and into the private elevator, rising swiftly to the top floor. When the doors opened, the emptiness of her home greeted her like it always did. Expansive rooms filled with elegant furniture, walls decorated with rare art, shelves lined with awards. Everything spoke of success, yet it all felt hollow tonight. Evelyn poured herself a glass of water and walked to the wide windows, staring at her own reflection against the city lights. For years, she had told herself she was strong because she needed no one, because she had risen alone where others had failed. But Marcus's face would not leave her thoughts. His strength had come not from money or independence, but from love, from a promise to his daughter, from values that had nothing to do with wealth. She realized that in all her victories, she had never once known what it meant to live for something greater than herself. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake in her vast bedroom, listening to the silence, feeling for the first time in years a sense of restlessness she could not ignore. She thought of Clara's small hands holding her father's, of the way the girl had whispered with absolute faith that he would keep his promise. That kind of trust was priceless, something Evelyn had never experienced. People respected her, feared her, admired her success, but no one trusted her the way Clara trusted Marcus. It was a kind of wealth she had never known existed. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the hospital, this time without assistants or bodyguards. She walked quietly through the corridors, carrying a small bag filled with books and puzzles for Clara, unsure if the girl would even want them. When she entered the room, she found Clara reading aloud to her father from one of her school books. Her voice soft, but filled with determination. Marcus listened with his eyes closed, smiling faintly at the sound. When Evelyn stepped inside, Clara looked up cautiously, still protective of her father, but not unkind. "I brought these for you," Evelyn said gently, placing the bag on the table. "I thought maybe you would like them while you were here." Clara peered inside, her eyes widening at the sight of colorful puzzles and storybooks. For a moment, the childlike excitement overtook her fear, and she whispered a quiet thank you. Evelyn felt her heart soften. It was such a small thing, yet it meant more to her than any contract she had ever signed. Marcus opened his eyes then, studying her with the same steady gaze that had unsettled her the night before. He said nothing, but she could sense the unspoken question in his look. Why was she here again? "I do not know what comes next for me," Evelyn admitted, her voice low, as if confessing a truth she had never shared before. "But I know this. Yesterday changed me. Watching you, watching the way you live for your daughter, for your promise, it opened my eyes. I have spent years believing strength was about control. You showed me it is about love. I cannot ignore that." Marcus remained silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Words are easy. Change is harder. You want this to mean something? Then let it mean something beyond this room." His words were not harsh, but they carried weight. Evelyn felt them settle deep in her chest. He was right. Change could not be spoken into existence. It had to be lived, step by step, choice by choice. She nodded slowly, accepting the truth. The days passed, and Evelyn returned again and again, sometimes bringing small meals for Clara, sometimes simply sitting quietly by Marcus's bed. She found herself drawn to the simplicity of their bond, the way even silence between them carried warmth. Slowly, she began to reflect on her own life, on the choices that had brought her here. She thought of employees she had treated as numbers, communities her company had overlooked, decisions that had placed profit above people. For the first time, guilt stirred not as a threat to her reputation, but as a call to do better. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara asked Evelyn a question that pierced her heart. "Do you have someone who makes promises too?" "You," The innocence in the girl's eyes made the question even heavier. Evelyn hesitated, realizing she had no answer. Her life had been filled with deals and contracts, not promises born of love. She shook her head slightly, unable to find words. Clara only nodded, as if she understood more than her age should allow, and returned to her puzzle. Evelyn sat quietly, feeling the ache of emptiness, but also the first spark of desire to fill it not with wealth, but with meaning. By the end of the week, Evelyn stood again at the window of her penthouse, but this time she did not see only her reflection. She saw Clara's smile, Marcus's unwavering eyes, the simple truth of a promise kept. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her life could be more than power. Perhaps it could be transformed by the very values she had once dismissed. Her awakening was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like the first light of dawn breaking through darkness. And though she did not yet know what choices she would make, she knew she could never return to who she had been before. The courthouse looked the same as it always had. But to Judge Whittaker, it no longer felt like the same place. The marble floors gleamed under the morning sun. The carved wooden doors stood as proud and tall as ever. And the hush of voices filled the great hall as reporters and citizens took their seats. Yet beneath all of it, there was a weight in the air that was new, a heaviness that clung to the silence between words. Something had shifted the moment Marcus Hale chose to stand in front of danger. The judge knew this trial would never again be just about evidence and testimony. Whittaker had been a judge for nearly 3 decades. It presided over countless cases, from petty disputes to matters that carried national attention. His gavel had silenced rooms filled with chaos, and his decisions had sent both criminals and innocents back into a world forever changed. Through it all, he had learned one unshakable truth. Law was about clarity, about rules that could not bend for emotion. Yet today, as he sat at the bench and looked down at the crowd gathering once more, his certainty wavered. Marcus had entered the room quietly, leaning heavily on crutches, his movements slow but steady. His daughter Clara walked beside him, her small hand resting against his arm, as if she believed her presence alone could carry his weight. The crowd fell into silence as he passed, their eyes following him not with pity but with reverence. Did not wear a uniform or a badge, yet people looked at him as if he carried authority greater than law itself. To Whittaker, it was a sight that unsettled him. Here was a man who had no power in the system, no wealth, no status. Yet his presence had silenced a courtroom in a way no gavel ever could. Evelyn Cross sat at the defense table, but her demeanor had shifted as well. Gone was the cool, untouchable air of a woman who believed she could win any battle with clever arguments and paid lawyers. In its place was a quieter resolve, as if she had been stripped of her armor and forced to confront the weight of truth. She avoided Marcus's gaze, yet every movement she made seemed to be shaped by the memory of his sacrifice. Judge Whittaker studied her closely, his eyes narrowing as he considered what lay before him. The law was clear, the charges against her company were serious, the evidence damning in many ways. But he also knew that law was not blind to humanity, and humanity was standing before him now in the form of Marcus Hale. A father who had turned a trial into a mirror, reflecting the very soul of justice. The session began as it always did, with voices echoing across the room, arguments laid out with precision. Yet Whittaker found himself distracted. He kept glancing at Marcus, at the way Clara sat beside him, her small face determined, as if she, too, had a stake in this moment. He thought of his own family, of his grandchildren, who often visited on weekends, of the promises he had made, too. Them to always be fair, always be strong, always be a man they could trust. The law gave him rules, but promises gave him meaning. Could he truly separate the two? As testimony continued, reporters scribbled notes furiously, capturing every detail. Yet the room remained strangely subdued. It was as though everyone sensed that the real story was no longer in the words spoken, but in the quiet presence of the man who had risked everything. Even the attorneys, usually so eager to dominate the room, found themselves speaking with less force. Their tones softened by the weight of unspoken truth. At one point, during a pause in the proceedings, Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his mind wandering. He remembered his earliest days as a young lawyer when he had believed justice was simple, a scale that could be balanced with facts and evidence. But life had shown him otherwise. Justice was not only about punishment, it was about transformation, about guiding people towards something greater than themselves. And in Marcus's act of selflessness, Whitaker saw the embodiment of what justice was meant to inspire. He tapped his pen against the bench, the small sound echoing in the still room. All eyes lifted toward him, waiting for his next words. Cleared his throat, his voice deep but strained. This court is not blind to the events that took place in this very room just days ago. We are reminded today that law exists not in isolation, but in the lives of those it touches. We will proceed with clarity, but let it be known that sacrifice does not go unnoticed within these walls. The words carried across the courtroom like a wave, settling in the hearts of everyone present. Evelyn lowered her head, tears brimming in her eyes, though she fought to hide them. Marcus shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, his focus still on his daughter rather than the crowd. Clara looked up at her father, her small face glowing with pride, as if she understood that his courage had reshaped more than just one trial. Whitaker let the silence linger before calling the next witness. Yet even as the session continued, his mind remained troubled. He felt a dilemma growing inside him, a question that no law book could answer. Could he deliver a judgment that satisfied the letter of the law, while ignoring the spirit of what he had witnessed? Could he look at Marcus Hale and tell him that justice was nothing more than contracts and statutes, when he had seen justice lived in the form of sacrifice? The session eventually drew to a close, but the judge did not rise immediately. For a long moment, staring at the wooden bench before him, lost in thought. The crowd began to murmur, uncertain, until he finally struck his gavel softly and adjourned for the day. His voice lacked its usual firmness, carrying instead the weight of a man who is deeply unsettled. As people filed out, Marcus rose slowly, leaning on his crutches, Clara steady at his side. The judge watched them go, his heart heavy, realized that the true verdict had not yet been written, and perhaps it never could be by law alone. Perhaps it would be written in the choices made beyond this room, in whether people like Evelyn Cross allowed themselves to change, in whether society learned to see justice not just in punishment but in humanity. That night, as Whitaker sat alone in his chambers, he removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. The silence of the empty room pressed against him. He had always prided himself on clarity, on certainty in the law. Yet for the first time in years, he felt speechless. His heart told him one thing, the law another. And between them stood the image of a father who had bled to keep his promise. For Judge Whitaker, the dilemma was no longer about a company or a CEO. It was about what justice truly meant, and whether he had the courage to honor it. Asterisk, the courtroom was hushed, filled with an uneasy anticipation that seemed to press down on every person in the room. The trial had dragged on for weeks, but today there was a different energy in the air, one that made even the most seasoned reporters sit straighter in their seats. Everyone knew this day mattered. It's not just for Evelyn Cross, not just for the company on trial, but for something far greater that had been stirred inside these walls ever since. Marcus Hale stood in front of danger. Without hesitation, Marcus sat near the back, supported by his crutches, his daughter Clara close beside him. She had refused to let go of his arm since the day of the attack, and her presence gave him the strength to endure the long hours of recovery. The pain in his chest was still sharp, every breath a reminder of the choice he had made, but he bore it without complaint. For him, this was not about recognition or glory. It was about showing his daughter that promises mattered, that courage mattered, and that doing the right thing was worth the cost. Judge Whitaker entered, his robe flowing behind him, and the room rose in silence. His expression was heavy, his eyes carrying the weight of sleepless nights spent turning over questions that had no easy answers. He sat down slowly, placing his hands on the bench, and for a moment simply looked out at the faces before him. He saw Evelyn seated at the defense table, her once confident posture replaced by something humbler. He saw Marcus, quiet yet steady, and Clara holding his hand, and he felt again the dilemma pressing inside his chest. What was justice truly? And could it ever be captured fully in the confines of law? The proceedings began with formalities, lawyers presenting final arguments, witnesses recalling facts, but all of it felt muted compared to the silence that followed. Evelyn Cross rose to her feet, and in that instant, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time since the trial began, she looked not at her attorneys, not at the judge, not even at the papers spread out before her. She looked at Marcus. Her voice trembled at first, unsteady, as if unused to speaking without the armor of rehearsed statements. "I cannot sit here any longer pretending that this trial is only about documents and evidence," she said. The courtroom stirred with whispers, reporters leaning forward, pens racing across paper. Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "The truth is, I built a company that grew powerful, but along the way, I made choices that were wrong. I allowed ambition to blind me, let profit weigh heavier than people. I silenced voices I should have listened to, and no matter how many excuses I could present, none of them erased what I allowed to happen." The judge's brow furrowed, surprised by the sudden confession. Attorneys shifted uncomfortably, some attempting to interrupt, but Evelyn raised her hand to silence them. Her gaze remained steady on Marcus. "When that man stood in front of me, when he risked his life without hesitation, I saw what I had forgotten. I saw what strength really means. It is not built on fear or control. It is built on sacrifice, on love, on promises kept even when it hurts. I cannot let his sacrifice mean nothing. So I am telling the truth now, even if it costs me everything." Gasps rippled across the room. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed. And yet in the center of the storm, there was stillness between Marcus and Evelyn. She had bared her soul, and for the first time in years, her words carried not the weight of power, but the weight of sincerity. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his hands folded tightly together. He was a man who had heard countless confessions, but never one like this. This was not coaxed by cross-examination or forced by evidence. This was a confession born of conscience, awakened by something the law could never demand. He found himself at a loss, his gavel heavy in his hand, his mind racing with the meaning of what he had just heard. The courtroom waited in silence, eyes fixed on the judge. But for a long moment, he said nothing. Inside him, the conflict grew stronger. By the law, his path was clear. The charges carried consequences, and Evelyn's admission only sealed them further. But beyond the law, there was something else, something raw and undeniable. He had seen the way Marcus's sacrifice had sparked change in Evelyn. How a man with nothing had given everything, and in doing so lit a fire in someone who had once been unreachable. Was that not also justice? Could justice exist only in punishment? Or could it also exist in transformation? He removed his glasses, setting them carefully on the bench. His voice, when it finally came, was softer than usual, almost hesitant. "This court is bound by law, but I am not blind to what I have witnessed here. There are times when justice is found not only in verdicts, but in the choices that follow them. Miss Cross, your words carry weight, but they will be measured not only today, but in the days ahead. Redemption is not given in speeches, it is proven in action." His words hung in the air, neither absolution nor condemnation, but something in between. Evelyn nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes, and sat down. She understood. The law would take its course, but her chance for change lay not in avoiding consequence, but in what she chose to do beyond it. Marcus shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the eyes on him. He had not wanted to become the center of all this. His choice had been simple in his heart: protect another person because it was the right thing to do. Yet he realized now that his actions had created ripples far greater than he had imagined. His daughter squeezed his hand, her small voice whispering, "See, Dad, you kept your promise." And now she's keeping one too. A judge adjourned the session, but as the crowd filed out, there was no usual chatter of legal speculation. Instead, people spoke of sacrifice, of change, of the strange and powerful way one man's courage had shifted the course of a trial. The headlines that evening would not only be about corporate wrongdoing, but about the human heart. About the way justice can awaken, even in the unlikeliest of places. That night, Evelyn sat alone, but for the first time. She did not feel untouchable. She felt accountable, humbled, but also hopeful. Marcus lay in his hospital bed with Clara curled against him, his promise intact. And Judge Whitaker remained in his chambers long after dark, staring at the empty bench before him, still speechless. At the realization that sometimes justice cannot be captured in words or laws, it must be lived. The final day of the trial arrived with a quiet gravity that even the buzzing of reporters could not drown out. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, voices rising in speculation. Inside the building, there was a stillness that felt almost sacred. Everyone who had followed the case knew that this was no longer about contracts or balance sheets. It's no longer only about guilt or innocence. Something larger had taken root here, something that no legal textbook could have predicted. And at the center of it all sat Marcus Hale, leaning on his crutches, his daughter Clara beside him, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. The days since Evelyn's confession had shifted public opinion in unexpected ways. Where once she had been painted as ruthless, people now spoke of her with cautious hope. There was skepticism. Of course, many wondered if her words were a performance, a last attempt to sway the court. But others saw the change in her eyes. The way her voice had trembled, not with strategy, but with sincerity. And in every conversation, Marcus's name was spoken with reverence. He had not asked for attention, yet the world could not look away from the man who had risked everything for a principle as simple as keeping a promise. Judge Whitaker entered the courtroom, expression unreadable. His robe seemed heavier than usual, his shoulders bowed under the burden of the decision he carried. He had spent sleepless nights wrestling with the law, with conscience, with the weight of what justice was meant to be. He had always believed in clarity, in the authority of statutes, but Marcus's act of selflessness had shaken that foundation. Today, he knew his words would echo far beyond this room. Evelyn sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly. Together, she looked nothing like the untouchable CEO who had first walked into this room weeks ago. There was no arrogance in her posture, no shield of cold confidence. Looked humbled, as though she understood that whatever sentence came next was not the end, but the beginning of a reckoning she had long avoided. When the court called for final statements, Evelyn rose slowly. Her voice carried not the polish of rehearsed lines, but the rawness of someone speaking from the heart. She admitted again to her failures, her blindness, her ambition that had come at the cost of others. She did not plead for mercy. She asked for the chance to make things right. She promised to use every resource she had not to protect herself, but to build something better. For the families her company had overlooked, for the workers who had been silenced, for children like Clara who deserved opportunities regardless of circumstance. The room was silent as she spoke, and when she finished, she turned and looked directly at Marcus. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Your sacrifice will not be wasted," she said softly. Words meant for him alone, though the whole courtroom heard them. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unused to being addressed with such gravity. He gave a small nod, not of agreement but of acknowledgement. His act had never been about Evelyn, never about the trial. It had been about doing what was right. If his choice had lit a spark in her, then perhaps something good could come of it. Judge Whitaker's gavel struck once, bringing the room to attention. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the space. This court recognizes the weight of the law, but it also recognizes the weight of humanity. Ms. Cross, your confession does not absolve you of responsibility. The law demands accountability, and so it shall be delivered. But this court also believes that justice is not found only in punishment, but in transformation. You will face consequences, but you will also have the opportunity to prove that your words today were more than sentiment. Your future actions will be your true verdict. His words carried across the room, and for the first time, Evelyn bowed her head not in defeat, but in acceptance. She understood that redemption would not be granted to her, it would have to be earned. The judge then paused, his gaze shifting to Marcus. The room followed his eyes. Suddenly, every person present was looking at the man who had changed everything without ever intending to. Whitaker's voice softened. Let it be remembered that this court is not blind to the courage displayed. In its very walls, a father's sacrifice has reminded us all of what justice is meant to protect. This will not be forgotten. For a long moment, silence filled the room, and then slowly, almost reverently, people began to rise to their feet. It was not the loud applause of celebration, but the quiet, respectful acknowledgement of something sacred. Marcus sat still, Clara gripping his hand tightly, her eyes wide as she looked around at the standing crowd. She leaned close and whispered, "They know, Dad. They know what you did." He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and whispered back, "All that matters is you know." When the session ended, Marcus rose carefully on his crutches, moving toward the exit, with Clara at his side. Evelyn watched him go, her heart heavy, but determined. She knew her journey toward change had only just begun, but she also knew that it had begun because of him. His promise to his daughter had become a mirror she could not ignore. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and citizens. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted, but Marcus did not stop. He guided Clara through the noise, his focus only on her. For him, the world could write whatever headlines it wanted. He was not a hero, not in his own eyes. He was a father who had done what needed to be done. That was enough. Later that evening, as the sun set over the city, Marcus sat on a park bench with Clara beside him. She leaned her head against his arm, content and safe. He watched her for a long time, the sound of her laughter carrying in the cool air, and he felt a peace he had not known in years. The world had changed around him, but his world was right here, his daughter, his promise, his legacy. Evelyn began her work quietly in the days that followed, announcing scholarships for children of single parents, funding programs for struggling communities, and setting aside a portion of her fortune to ensure opportunities reached those who had been overlooked. People doubted her at first, but over time, actions spoke louder than her past. Though she would always live with the shadow of her mistakes, she had chosen to walk in the light of change. Judge Whitaker, too, carried the memory with him. In his chambers late at night, he often thought of Marcus Hale, the man who had forced him to see justice not only in statutes but in sacrifice. He told his grandchildren about the day a father with nothing reminded a courtroom of everything that truly mattered. And as for Marcus, he returned to his quiet life, raising Clara with the same devotion he always had. His name was written in articles, his face shown on screens, but in the end, none of that mattered to him. What mattered was the promise he had made to his daughter, the promise he had kept even when it nearly cost him everything. The legacy of a single father was not measured in fame or recognition. It was measured in love, in sacrifice, in the way his choices changed not only the life of his daughter, but the lives of those who watched and learned from his example. And though the world might forget the details of the trial, it would never forget the image of Marcus Hale standing firm in a courtroom, proving that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from power or wealth, but from the simple, unshakable promise of a father.